My Govanen. Welcome to Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to cover another one of Tolkien's non-Middle-earth related writings, the Lay of Sigurd and the Lay of Gudrun. Well, not exactly called that. The book they're published in is called The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, and it's edited by Christopher Tolkien, and these are two poems that Tolkien wrote about Sigurd, or Siegfried, or, depending on which language you're reading the legend in, and Gudrun, his wife. And they come from, of course, the old story of Sigurd who killed the dragon Fafnir. And Tolkien did some interesting things with this story, as Christopher Tolkien kind of describes in some of the commentary on the poem itself. So I'll get into a little bit of that. I'll talk about the basic plot of the two poems, and I'll talk about a little bit of some of the interesting ways in which this actually connects to his Middle-earth mythology. So let's take a look. So as far as the basic plot of the poems, Tolkien in some ways kind of combines material from what's called the Elder or Poetic Edda, and also the Prose Edda, and just different versions of these stories from different sources, and puts a lot of it together to form kind of a long, coherent story, because he actually starts long before Sigurd comes into play, with Odin and Loki having kind of a small adventure, getting involved with some evil dude who captures them and then demands gold for repayment. Loki manages to get them out of this quandary by kind of stealing the gold from somebody, and then turns out that one of the sons of this bad guy who has them kind of trapped is Fafnir, and also another guy who will come up later, but we'll get to that. So anyway, Loki gets them out of this, and the next thing we know, we're talking about some other stuff. We get a prophecy about Ragnarok, and how the world's chosen if one who has tasted death but will not taste death again, will fight in the last battle. Then Odin will be victorious in Ragnarok. And then we get Odin kind of starting up the whole Valhalla thing, trying to get warriors in to Valhalla who will end up fighting for him, and they're all waiting in Valhalla for the world's chosen. And the world's chosen, just as a spoiler, because we're going to get there anyway, is going to end up being Sigurd. But in the meantime, he's gathering all these other warriors. So the next major thing we get is, now we move into the Volsungs, which is, Volsung just happens to be this one particular guy whose line ends up coming to Sigurd. But first he has a son named Sigmund and some others, and he also has this daughter. The daughter he marries off to some, lord in a different country, and she has kind of a bad feeling about this. This lord invites them to his place, basically, for a feast, which turns out badly because he ends up killing the father and putting Sigmund and his brothers in a tight spot by basically leaving them out in the woods chained up to some trees and letting wolves devour them. Now, here's one interesting place where the connection to Middle-earth mythology comes in, because if you know your Silmarillion, this should ring some bells, because this is actually a lot like what happens to Beren and Finrod and their companions when they get captured by Sauron. So anyway, much like Beren in that story, Sigmund ends up being the only one left, and eventually he ends up getting free and kind of disguises himself as a dwarven smith, working off the grid and keeping himself on the down low. Anyway, eventually Sigmund's sister, who is the queen at this point in this country, comes up with a plan to get revenge, and Sigmund carries this out and eventually kills the king. But the sister she's just so heartbroken over the fact that all the rest of her family is gone, decides to just kind of die as well, and they burn down the hall, and she just stays in it and basically commits suicide. Sigmund and he has a son, and they go off, and then he ends up having another son, Sigurd, of course, and eventually the other son gets killed. Sigurd ends up being the only one left, and he's kind of the only he's more or less an orphan and not really. Sigmund had a kingdom, but he's in no position to inherit it because it's basically been taken over. And Odin has some hand in this. There's this old man who pops up several times in the story who makes things happen, and in this particular instance he actually kind of causes Sigmund to lose. One of the interesting things about this is another connection to Middle-earth mythology, because Sigmund in this battle ends up having his sword, which was kind of a really cool special sword, broken, and the shards get passed down to Sigurd, which is kind of reminiscent of Aragorn inheriting the shards of Narsil. At any rate, Sigurd ends up being brought up kind of just as an apprentice to a smith, who, by the way, is the other son of that evil guy who had captured Odin and Loki in the very beginning. And he tells Sigurd, hey, there's this dragon with this huge hoard, and you should go after it and get it. And Sigurd's like, why are you so keen on me doing this? And it comes out that basically Fafnir the dragon was his brother, and basically said, well, I'm just going to keep this entire hoard for myself, and you can't have any. Or at least that's the story he tells. And so anyway, eventually Sigurd gets himself a really awesome horse, and he reforges the sword, and he goes after Fafnir. He eventually kills Fafnir, and here again we get some Middle-earth connections, because Fafnir is kind of acting like Glaurung in that he just gets the gold and he hoards it and he sits on it, and then he just doesn't really do anything else with it. And also because Sigurd then comes along and stabs him from beneath, much like Turin ends up stabbing Glaurung in the story of Turin. So there's that. Sigurd, of course, does kill Fafnir. He gets the gold, and the other character says, you know, cook me his heart. And Sigurd is in the process of doing this, not really knowing why, and he licks his fingers with the blood of it on it, and suddenly he can understand the voice of animals and birds and stuff. And he hears these birds basically saying that this guy is gonna like kill Sigurd, he's gonna betray him. And so he doesn't. He leaves him, but the birds also talk about this Valkyrie who is. I don't think they call her a Valkyrie at this point, but they talk about this woman who's, you know, would make a great queen, basically. And so Sigurd goes off in search of her, and this is Brynhild. He makes it to where Brynhild is, and it's interesting because he comes upon her, and she's at first he thinks that this is just a man in a suit of armor, because that's all you can see is a suit of armor, and it's like the suit of armor has almost become part of the body of whoever it's wearing. But he takes his sword, cuts the armor off, and there's Brynhild. Brynhild then awakes. She had been basically put into a sleep by Odin because she had refused to. Basically, what had happened, she had made somebody die that Odin didn't want to die, and so he basically said, you're not going to be a Valkyrie anymore, you're going to end up marrying. And she's like, well, I'm only going to marry the world's greatest warrior. So then she gets put to sleep. So she ends up basically saying, okay, I'm going to marry you, Sigurd, because you're the world's greatest warrior, because he made it to where she was, which was actually a really hard place to get. So well, this actually also comes up later too, but we'll get to that. The story then proceeds because Brynhild basically says, you got to be a king first, though. So Sigurd goes off basically in search of a way to become a king, and this, you know, there's ways he could go about this, but he doesn't. He's just one guy, and so he doesn't really have the means to retake his father's kingdom. So he goes to this place where this king called Giuki reigns, and I may be totally mangling that name. I don't know my Norse. But anyway, he goes there, and he has a son named Gunnar, and a son or a half son, or it's not really clear because the different sources in Tolkien, it's clear, but the different sources of it kind of have different relationships with Hogni, which is the other son, or not son, depending on how you look at it. And he ends up making alliance with them, and they take him in, and they're pretty happy about having him because he's this really great warrior who killed a dragon and is really wealthy. So they're all happy to be with, you know, in alliance with him, basically. So they end up doing a lot of things together, and Sigurd does kind of end up winning, not exactly a kingdom, because he's still in some sense a vassal to this other king, but he's, he's got his own position at this point. And he's thinking about, going back to get Brynhild now that he's managed all of these other things. Unfortunately, they also have a sister named Gudrun, or Gudrun, again, I'm not exactly sure I'm pronouncing that right, and she really likes Sigurd. So her mom, who is a little too smart for her own good, because she gets her family into trouble, she mixes up this potion to give to Sigurd and basically make him think only of Gudrun and not Brynhild, just completely forget about Brynhild. And so he ends up marrying Gudrun, and then somehow or other the brothers find out about Brynhild, who is staying in this place which is apparently protected by this ring of fire, and uh, Gunnar wants to marry her, and the mom is like, well, go get her, take Sigurd, and go, just go do whatever you got to do. And they get there, and Gunnar can't get his horse to go through the ring of fire. And so Sigurd ends up being the one to go through, and this goes back to the whole idea of the person who can actually get to Brynhild as the world's greatest warrior. So he gets through on his really cool horse, whose name escapes my mind at the moment, but at any rate, he gets through, gets to Brynhild, and he is in magical disguise as Gunnar, so she doesn't recognize him as Sigurd. And she's all confused, like, you're not Sigurd, and yet you made it in. But anyway, she kind of holds herself bound to the promise that she would marry the one who could get past the ring of fire. And so they end up, essentially plighting their troth there. Although what we do find out is that Sigurd doesn't sleep with her that night. He actually puts a sword between them, so he doesn't do anything with Gunnar's future wife, because he doesn't want to, go into that. At any rate, after they leave, then of course Sigurd and Gunnar switch places again. Brynhild ends up marrying Gunnar, and everything seems to be going okay, except Gudrun and Gunnar, I mean, not Gudrun, Gudrun and Brynhild eventually go to bathe in the river, and they start talking about how awesome their respective husbands are. Brynhild, of course, has already noticed that Sigurd is here, and you get some indication that maybe Sigurd has started to put a few things together himself, but Brynhild is a little further along than that, but she's also kind of clinging to this idea that Gunnar actually is the one who beat Sigurd out somehow. But Gudrun kind of spills the beans on what actually happened, and now Brynhild is like, okay, now I'm mad and everybody's gonna die. So she ends up, uh, it gets nasty. She starts spreading rumors basically about who's being faithful to whom, and she talks to Gunnar and basically implies that Sigurd actually did sleep with her when he came, and so now Gunnar is mad at Sigurd. Sigurd ends up getting murdered in his bed by Hogni as a result of all this. And then as a result of that, then you get Brynhild basically either, I can't remember now, either committing suicide or something, but at any rate, she ends up dead. So Sigurd is gone, Brynhild is gone, and all that's left is Gunnar and Hogni and their sister, who was married to Sigurd. So that's kind of the end of the story of Sigurd, at which point, of course, he goes off to Valhalla. The second poem is where we see kind of the conclusion of all this mess. And it's shorter and a little more straightforward and to the point. After all this has happened, Gudrun has kind of gone off and is living on her own, basically weaving this tapestry about all the things that have happened, which is actually an interesting throwback because Brynhild had been weaving a tapestry about Sigurd before he came in the guise of Gunnar to come woo her, basically. In the backdrop of all this, though, Attila the Hun is out east and threatening to invade into the west. And in the poem, he's called Atli, not Attila, but it's Christopher Tolkien makes it clear in the notes and commentary that this is the same person. And this is, real historical backdrop. I mean, there's historical backdrop to these legends. So Gudrun is basically convinced by the mom, who is again really scheming, to marry Attila and make an alliance with him so they don't just overrun, their lands and whatnot. And she's not super happy about this, but eventually it happens anyway. So Attila eventually gets it into his head that he wants the dragon horde, which was, you at least get the idea that he expected to get some of that as a dowry for Gudrun anyway, and that they never did follow through on that. It's not exactly 100% clear what they promised him, but at any rate, he ends up having this idea that he's going to invite them to his hall and then basically either kill them or do whatever he has to do to get the gold. So he invites them, and the invitation is interesting. He sends this messenger who, invites them and basically promises them, wealth and great stuff. And they're all like, well, why do we need to do that when we have all this good stuff ourselves? And also, Gudrun sent something that appeared to be a message of warning, which was overwritten by somebody else, either the person that was sent with the message or, maybe Attila himself or Atli, however you want to call him. And the brothers kind of have this back and forth about, should we go, should we not go? And at first they're like, no, this is a bad idea. And the mom, for once is actually right. Don't do that. That's bad. She's clearly trying to warn y'all. And at any rate, the messenger ends up basically kind of challenging the brothers' ego. And at that point, they're like, okay, we're going. So, ego always gets in your way. Don't let your ego get in the way, because this is pride going before a fall in a big way in this poem. So they go, and Atli, of course, ends up betraying them, and he attacks them. And it's interesting because Hogni and Gunnar and their men actually end up kind of taking part of the fortress and holding out for several days until Atli tries to burn them out. And eventually they do get overcome and captured. Hogni is put into a cell somewhere while Gunnar is talking to Atli about the treasure, and he's trying to, basically coerce him into giving up Fafnir's hoard. And Gunnar basically says, well, Hogni's a hardhead, he'll never give you his, so you're just going to have to kill him. And this is interesting because they don't actually want to kill him, and partially because Gudrun doesn't want to kill him, Atli doesn't want to kill him, so they get some like menial servant and kill him and bring the heart to Gunnar, and the heart is quivering. He's like, that's a coward's heart. That's not Hogni's heart. So they end up having to actually kill Hogni, who then, when they bring his heart, he said, yep, that one's not quivering. That's a courageous heart right there. That's Hogni. And you know what? Now that the gold is all mine, I'm never giving it up. We threw it into the Rhine. Which is another throwback to, or not throwback, but another Middle-earth reference, because after the dwarves sack Menegroth in the, when they kill Thingol and then try to steal the Silmaril and a whole bunch of other gold, Baron and his group of green elves off in the east ambush them on their way back to their halls, and all that treasure, except for the Silmaril itself, pretty much ends up in the river. So there again, you can kind of see the same kind of connections. At any rate, Gunnar basically says, ha, fooled you, you're not getting anything. So, of course, Gunnar dies too. And after this, Gudrun really goes off the deep end. She kills her own 2 kids and has Atli drink unknowingly their blood out of, was it their skulls or was it just regular cups? I forget now. But at any rate, she points all this out, and then she burns down the hall and takes herself out with it. So you kind of get the same repeated theme of like women in really bad distress just taking it out on everybody, including themselves, that we got in the Sigurd part of this poem. So it all ends in terrible tragedy, which again is kind of fitting with that historical backdrop, because in the historical backdrop, the Huns really do wreak a lot of havoc in, Europe when they come around. So at any rate, that's pretty much the basic plot of both poems. I'm leaving out a lot of detail, but I'm trying to summarize. So let's take a look at some of the more interesting things. So apart from the poems themselves, Christopher has a significant amount of commentary on the poems where he discusses the various sources of these poems by Tolkien. And he mentions, there's the poetic versions, there's the prose versions, and there's a German version that, that's where Siegfried comes in as opposed to Sigurd. It's, a bunch of different versions of these stories, and he kind of gives some details as to the differences between these different poems and the prose versions and whatnot. He also gives some of Tolkien's own writings and thoughts on how these stories developed over time and how, when certain elements came in, how the Sigurd and Fafnir story came to be connected with, the Huns and the Gunnar story, because they're kind of really separate stories, but they end up being all combined into this. And so he gives a lot of the thoughts that Tolkien had, kind of summarizes those, and even quotes passages from Tolkien on that as well, because Tolkien actually taught, classes on these kinds of poems. So there's a lot of that going on, and he also has elements of just the broader actual historical context. He brings a lot of that in to bear to explain a lot of what's going on. And he gives just a background too of the legends themselves. Just, here's like behind all of this stuff, there's all of this Norse mythology that you don't get much of in the poems as they're presented. So he kind of has to give a little bit of a backdrop. So there's a lot of commentary and additional material here. Another interesting thing about this is the fact that Tolkien kind of adds in the element of Sigurd being the world's chosen, who, if he fights in Ragnarok, will bring Odin victory. Tolkien kind of creates that, or at least infers it, because it's not explicit in any of the old legends. In most of the old legends, I think, I'm not super familiar with my Norse mythology here, but I think the general idea is the gods lose Ragnarok. But here, Tolkien brings this idea that if Sigurd fights in the final battle, it'll all turn out okay. Which, again, this is a slightly more oblique reference to Middle-earth mythology, but in that way, Sigurd is almost like Turin again, because if you read the History of Middle-earth series, there is actually at least one or two references to Turin in the last battle. At the end of everything will be the one to deal Morgoth his death blow with his black sword. So there's kind of a similar idea there too, which is really interesting. So there's a lot of discussion of the legends themselves, the historical backdrop, how all of this gets interrelated, and how Tolkien kind of brings it all together into this kind of new version of these stories. And basically what Tolkien is trying to do is create a coherent narrative from disjointed pieces here and there that don't really all fit together. And part of that is because some of the older legends were lost and they were kind of rewritten and modified over the ages, and there's a lot of editing that goes on over time. And like a great huge portion of the source material for all this was lost in a fire that was, only a very small amount was saved, and then there's a whole big gap because of some of the material that's missing that Tolkien has to fill in somehow. He's trying to figure out how would this work out. So Christopher Tolkien gives a lot of commentary on how Tolkien was working through all these ideas and how he put it together in these poems. As far as the poems themselves, it's interesting because they're written in the alliterative verse style that the Lay of Turin, or the Children of Hurin, in the Lays of Beleriand is written. It's that Anglo-Saxon alliterative style, which is, it takes getting used to, but the more I read it, the more I enjoy it. I will say that in this one, which, if I'm not mistaken, this is actually the earliest, major attempt by Tolkien to write like a long poem in that style. And you can kind of tell because he's not as polished at it as he is in later attempts. So, I mean, like he also did a poem on the fall of Arthur, which I will do in the future as well. in the same style, which is, in my opinion, much better written. And even the Children of Hurin lay is, to my mind, a better version of that poetic style than the lay of the Volsungs and the lay of Gudrun that he presents here. But nevertheless, I mean, it's an interesting poetic read just on its own terms because it is that different kind of style. So there's definitely that. If you're really into that kind of poetry, this is an early example of Tolkien doing that. Beyond that, that's pretty much the entire book, at least what I want to talk about it. There's definitely a lot more detail you could go into, but for a general book review, I think that pretty much covers it. So, hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you maybe think about picking up the Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun now. Maybe you can figure out the pronunciation better than I can. I'm really not that well versed in it, but if you know where I'm messing up, please leave a mention in the comments below. At any rate, if you did like it, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around for anybody else who might be interested in picking up some non-Middle-earth Tolkien-related writings. And you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for occasional Tolkien trivia. And you can subscribe to the channel here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support the channel here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.